Precisely who it is. We finished.
This curse.
No.
This is a damn curse.
Please go.
Help me.
Curse.
I must live.
So in contrast to the previous two areas that we did that were very small, Central Yharnam is absolutely massive. And as befits an extremely large area, its focus isn't on an individual or an institution. It's on the city itself, the kind of city it is, the kind of place it used to be, the kind of place that it's become, and the kind of people that live there.
Can you just describe what is part of Central Yharnam?
So Central Yharnam is everything from Yosefka's clinic through to Cathedral Ward. And that's kind of important because Cathedral Ward being blockaded is part of the story. At this point in Yharnam's history, they've turned on the Healing Church.
What is Cathedral Ward?
Cathedral Ward is basically the central church district of Yharnam. It's where the Grand Cathedral and Erden Chapel are. You can see that it used to connect to Central Yharnam, but they have destroyed the bridge that did it.
Okay, right.
So I want to talk about Yharnam's relationship to outsiders because it defines our character's relationship to the city, but it also tells you a lot about the kind of city it was and its relationship to the world outside. So Yharnam is quite curious in the way that, on the one hand, it is clearly this ancient, sprawling metropolis that we only see a little tiny piece of. But also, it's somewhere that's really, really hostile to anyone from outside. So it raises the question of, well, how did it get this huge? How did it get this powerful if it doesn't want to deal with anything else?
That's actually a really good question.
So if we look specifically at the way that Yharnam is reacting to our presence, we get a kind of picture of its relationship with the outside world. Because Yharnam's insularity and Yharnam's xenophobia exist in tandem with them being very aware of and engaged with the presence of outsiders. When we show up in Yharnam as an outsider, it's not that the Yharnamites are suspicious of us and keeping to themselves like you would expect somewhere that was very insular. They immediately try to kill us. And they have these militia patrols that are going around the city. Yes, they are hunting for beasts, but their response when they see us is to scream outsider, and that alerts the other Yharnamites to our presence. So clearly Yharnam does have a relationship with the outside world. It has an established relationship where people are coming and going. And if you look at what is in Central Yharnam on the streets, one of the most common things you see is you see suitcases. And if you look at what else is lying around Yharnam, it's horses and carriages. And then later on in Central Yharnam, they make a point of there is a whole area that is specifically a dry dock for boats. And the path that we take to where Gascoigne is, that is very specifically a drained aqueduct. So they're not just making you go down streets. They are very, very clearly foregrounding that Yharnam is a place where people travel to. If it was a completely insular city, there would be no need for this stuff. The game also makes a point of identifying most of the NPCs we interact with in Yharnam as outsiders. So Gilbert, the first character we meet, is an outsider. Gascoigne is an outsider. Volta and Yamamura are also both outsiders that specifically came to Yharnam to hunt beasts. We also learn that the first of the Hunter of Hunters came from outside of Yharnam. So Yharnam is clearly somewhere that people know about and somewhere that has a very strong relationship with the outside world. It's just at the same time, it's extremely hostile.
So let me ask you, how do outsiders learn about Yharnam and find Yharnam?
This is a good question because we don't know. How our character learns about Yharnam is something that the game never ever specifies, because when our character awakens after the ministration, they very specifically have amnesia and they have forgotten why they came to Yharnam.
And as a player, we may have some sort of a, I guess, idea what our character is like because we can pick them from the creation screen.
We pick an origin for our character, but that just tells us where we came from. It doesn't tell us how we got to Yharnam. The one thing we do know about our character for sure is that we came to Yharnam looking for paleblood. Because the first thing we hear from the minister is,
Oh, yes. Pale blood. Well, you've come to the right place.
our character isn't amnesiac then. We're amnesiac when we wake up, but before we go to sleep, we're not. He's responding to us asking for paleblood.
And another interesting thing about pale blood is that we find a note in the room where we awaken that tells us seek pale blood to transcend the hunt.
That note is interesting because it's described as the handwritten scroll. And the way that's written in Japanese is like basically note in someone's handwriting. Like if someone had a distinct handwriting style, it's written like that. The implication there is that we recognize our own handwriting, but because we have amnesia, it doesn't quite make sense to us. It really doesn't make sense if that note was left by someone in Yharnam, because the first character we talk to about paleblood is the minister, and he doesn't know what it is. And then we leave and talk to Gilbert, and Gilbert doesn't know what it is. So this is not something that people are aware of in Yharnam. It's something that we knew about, and that certain members of the School of Mensis know about, and that Lawrence knew about, but it's a very closely guarded secret. So our character knew something about paleblood, maybe just the word paleblood, when they came to Yharnam. So Yharnam having this odd relationship with outsiders where they're coming and going, but Yharnam are very hostile to them, is something that informs its relationship with the Healing Church. Lawrence, the founder of the Healing Church, is not from Yharnam. He is from Bergenworth. The Healing Church has its roots in Bergenworth. Characters from the Healing Church specifically are dressed like they're from Bergenworth. But Yharnam, the city that hates outsiders, welcomes the Healing Church in and allows them to reach this level of influence, become the most powerful institution in the city. Very, very rapidly. The game is a little cagey on the timeline, but from what we actually see, the Healing Church have only really been in Yharnam for about 20 or 30 years. And in that time, they've become that powerful.
So that's kind of ironic, because Yharnam doesn't like outsiders. So Lawrence comes from the school of Bergenworth.
Lawrence comes from Bergenworth, and crucially, he comes from Bergenworth with the old blood. So Yharnam is really, really unbelievably old.
How old?
Well, I am going to suggest it is pre-human. Yharnam's history is tied up in the Chalice Dungeons. This is another situation where the game is a little weird mechanically about how something works, but if you pay attention to how characters talk about it and how it's described, it becomes clearer. So even though our character, is going into the Chalice Dungeons via this strange warping mechanic in the Hunter's Dream, the Chalice Dungeons are very specifically the lower parts of Yharnam. They're underground. They're just the catacombs of Yharnam. If you go down deep enough, you hit the Chalice Dungeons. Yharnam's history being in the Chalice Dungeons is kind of the story of the Chalice Dungeons. They're an area that's talked about as though they don't really have a story, but they do. As we go deeper into the dungeons and acquire more and more chalices, they tell us more and more about the history of Thumaru. We learn that the Thumarians started off as the servants of the Great Ones. Then at some point, the Thumarians rebelled and achieved a kind of independence. From that independence, they created their own society, and that society was a monarchy. And it specifies that the monarch of Thumaru was traditionally a woman who would take a ceremonial name with what it says are classical roots, as in she's taking a Thumarian name. And when we get to the very bottom of the dungeon, literally the bottom, we cannot go deeper, the final thing that we encounter in the dungeons is one of those queens. And her name is Yharnam. Yharnam is a Thumerian name. Yharnam is a Thumerian city. What happened was the Thumerians, after they achieved independence and named themselves a queen and formed their own society, they just built up and up and up from underground until they popped out the top. Over time, the Thumerians on the surface just became the Yharnamites. They lost some of, but not all of, their Thumerian physical traits, but they retained a lot of Thumerian history and Thumerian culture. Obviously, the city's name is taken from a Thumerian word. We also have, later on, Erden Chapel. Characters refer to that area as Erden. It's a word that they know, but they don't seem to be aware that Erden is actually a great one that inhabits the area. They just remember the name. If we look at the architecture of Central Yharnam, it's a place where they use messengers as gargoyles. The fountain in the square near Gascoigne's house is the same as the fountains that we see in the Chalice dungeons. There's a lot of other little Thumerian traditions that carry on. There's the burning beasts that we see throughout Central Yharnam. We don't quite see anything that dramatic in the chalices, but we do see them using dead animals as fuel for fires, because presumably the smell of the burning flesh is warding off beasts. We also have these coffins that are just lying around, almost casually, which makes Yharnam feel like it is an extension of those catacombs where all those bodies were buried. The other way they get rid of bodies in Yharnam is that they hang them. We see them hanging from the ceiling in the dry dock. We see a lot of hanging bodies in Old Yharnam, and we also see a lot of hanging bodies in Hemwick, which isn't part of Yharnam, but it's from the same roots as Yharnam. And hanging bodies and bodies in cages is something that we see a lot in the Chalice dungeons. It is everywhere. There's probably more bodies hanging than there are in coffins. So when we learn about the Hunter of Hunters, it specifies that they dress as a crow to symbolize sky burial. So sky burial is a means of corpse disposal where, rather than burying a body, it's deliberately left somewhere high and somewhere that is exposed, so that carrion birds, like crows, will come and eat away at the body and dispose of it that way. So you might think that's what they're doing, but it says that they practice that to save people from what they call a blasphemous Yharnam burial. They don't specify exactly what these blasphemous practices are, but Yharnam comes from Thumeru, and we know that the Thumerians were essentially a culture of necromancers. All their rituals involved the use of body parts, so when we go into those chalices, the things we find there are the blood, also the mold that grew on the putrefying flesh. We have the wrists, the backbones, the hair, the stillborn children. So the point isn't exactly what they're doing with the bodies in Yharnam. The point is more that bodies are not safe in Yharnam. So you might get your grave robbed, not because you're buried with things of monetary value, but because your body continues to have value. So because Yharnam comes from this tradition that is all about bodies, that's all about bodily functions and bodily fluids and body parts and the reproduction of bodies and the consumption of bodies, your body continues to be something that people want to control even after you're dead. If you look at the description of the shining coins, it says that they might be of value the following day, meaning when the hunt is over. But looking at the state that Yharnam is currently in, there really is no after the hunt anymore, so really nothing matters anymore except for blood and flesh. Thumerians were obsessed with blood. They were essentially a civilization of vampires. And that continued on through Yharnam's history. If you read about Yharnam traditions, they were drinking blood. They were making more blood than alcohol. They were telling stories about outsiders while they sat around drinking blood. even before the Healing Church were a thing.
Other than item descriptions, is there any other evidence of Yharnamites drinking blood?
There's a few interesting corpses with pungent blood cocktails on them. Because pungent blood cocktails that's the blood equivalent of drinking like pure vodka. The first corpse that you're likely to get a pungent blood cocktail from is in the dark house near where Gilbert is. And it's on a corpse that is in front of a cabinet. And it's been shot by the guy that lives there. The implication I always took from that is that it's someone who is raiding his liquor cabinet. And there's a corpse in Old Yharnam that's someone with a pungent blood cocktail and they're just leaning against a wall. And that always struck me as is this just a guy who is drinking in the street? And Old Yharnam itself is very interesting because there's just blood worship everywhere in that place. It seems to predate anything the Healing Church did because it's the older part of Yharnam. They were always a place that, because of that origin, even though they may have forgotten where they came from, they have kept those traditions. They have kept the obsession with blood and the obsession with keeping that blood pure. So having established that the Healing Church are foreigners, but they're also the most powerful entity in this city that hates foreigners, there's this question of, well, how did they get there? How did they achieve this position when logically the town should hate them?
Does it have anything to do with blood?
Yeah, because when Lawrence first arrives in Yharnam from Bergenworth, what he has with him is the old blood. And as far as we can tell, that's all he had with him.
Mm-hmm.
Old blood is from the Labyrinth. It's from the Chalice Dungeons. The old blood is literally Yharnam's old blood. And what Lawrence is doing is he's bringing their own past back to them. So even though Lawrence is an outsider and the Healing Church are outsiders, they have access to that blood. They have control over Yharnam's heritage. They have control over its past, and they show them that blood. And that's how they rise to power. So when we go into the Labyrinth and we go to the bottom and we meet Queen Yharnam, that's not the current version of Queen Yharnam, it's the past version. It's the version when she was pregnant, it's the version before Murgo was stolen from her. And the reason we can do that is that the deeper we go, we are actually going back. We're going back further and further in time. The same thing is true of the Hunter's Nightmare, where we start in a memory of the most recent events in Yharnam's history, and the further back we go back and back and back to the beginning until the end of that nightmare is the event that triggered everything that happened in the game. It's the killing of Kos. So what the Healing Church are doing when they mess around with this blood and when they mess around with chalices is that they're just opening up history again. They're opening up the past, they're bringing parts of it back, and you can see Yharnam is starting to revert into being a Thumerian place again. But having seized on that, having stoked that fire to rise to power, it's also what ends up destroying them. It's what sends Yharnam against the Healing Church. Once they stop giving Yharnam what it wants, they just become outsiders. Only now they're trapped inside Yharnam. They can't get out. And that leads us to the next area, which is Cathedral Ward.